I've been asked a few times to do more of ways to get color and paint onto fabric. I thought it would be good to review some ways, in fact, 5 different ways of how I might put color and paint onto fabric. I wanted to start by showing you what my setup is. I've put a fresh cover onto my print table. And if you're interested in making a print table, I'll link the video here in this description. I've also put some plastic down just to keep it looking fairly clean. I'm not too worried about that, but in fact, it helps so that the color doesn't soak right into the print table. I've got a piece of plexiglass that I've covered with Glad press and seal. I like to use this so that rather than rinsing out my palette and putting the acrylic down the sink, I can use up as much as possible here, then take this off and put it into the garbage. It's not a perfect solution, but it works fairly well for what I want to do. And honestly, once the paint has dried onto the press and seal, more paint can be applied to it. I've got some fluid acrylic. I generally don't use textile paints for something like this. They're more expensive, and I find the acrylics are fine. I've got the fabrics labeled with the kind of fabric it is and what I'm putting onto it. I use T-pins to put the fabric and keep it stationary on the print table. For the first demo, I've got a block. It's actually a commercial stamp on one side, but I've put double-sided tape down and bamboo skewers on here. I've used it so many times that it's totally sealed, and I can just clean it off easily with a damp cloth each time. I've put the black acrylic down, and I've spread it out about the same size as the stamp here. It's fairly thin. I'm going to go in with the stamp and take several pumps to get it onto the surface. What I love about the irregularity of this is that you can play with different ways of putting it on. What I find I like best is to then go back into this when it's dry and use other colors, and do that 2 or 3 or more times to get some really interesting texture building up on that. The next way is to create a stencil with a little bit of either stencil film or something quite thin. You can buy stencil film at the art store. Used to use X-ray film, but who does real X-rays anymore? It's all digital. Something that is very thin. That's the key here. I've got a stencil brush, and I'm going into the paint. Rather than bumping up and down in a traditional manner with stencils, I am just going back and forth. This is the silk Dupioni, so it has threads that are raised, and I'm going to just put a little bit more paint down. And some fabrics, of course, will take far more paint as they soak it up than others. Remember to rotate whatever you're working on, whether it's a stencil or a stamp. We can turn it and we'll get a little bit of a variation on the design. When you're changing colors or overlapping, just take the time to make sure that the first application is dry before you go any further. This next one I'm excited about because I was looking at the cardboard and thought that the grooves would be good placement to put a few brushes in. I chose some kind of grotty shaped brushes that I wasn't too concerned about and put them down into the grooves and tape them so you can see just like that. Super easy to do. And the neat thing is that you can then take certain brushes out or rearrange them. You could put different brushes, different widths down at the same time and play with the application. Now I know that the brush is probably going to create a bit of drag, so I've actually added a few pins. This is old table linen that I have here, and I'm going to dip the ends of the brushes into the paint, and I'll do both sides to get a good application. There, I'm just going to hold the cloth down so it doesn't drag. Now with this, you could play around with different movements across the surface, also create that checkerboard effect across, and you could try different colors. Those are 4 ways to put lines onto fabric, and any of these could be replicated onto paper as well. Now I'm going to pause for a minute, put more fabric down, and show you another way of working. I have some just PFD cotton down on the print table, and it's been lightly dyed. I've got a couple of old grotty paintbrushes that have seen better days. Don't use your good brushes for this exercise. Pair of scissors. We're going to do a little bit like what we did in just the last little bit to create multiple lines, but we're going to cut into the brush so that we're creating lines, and you could make them a little bit irregular. Of course, once you've done this, it's permanent, but you get the idea. It looks a little bit like a sawtooth. I've got my little palette here. I'm just going to pop a little bit more paint on there. We'll load up the brush, then begin with lines. We're getting sort of scratchy type lines. Some of the fibers are still catching some paint. And then we can, as we've done, go crisscross. We could do more like a diagonal. Let's see about the wiggly lines. Wavy lines, that's a possibility too. You can see that it takes a lot more paint than what we were doing with the stamps.